name is Marie Dumoulin. I'm the director of ECFR Wider Europe program. And I'm very pleased that we are joined today by Sviatlana Tskhanouskaya, whom you all know as the leader of Belarusian democratic opposition, and by Radoslaw Sikorski, a former Polish foreign minister and now a member of the European Parliament. My colleague Pavel Flunkin will introduce and moderate this discussion. He himself is a former Belarusian diplomat who left Belarus after August 2020 and joined ECFR a few weeks after that, and who is our best expert on Belarus. So please, Pavel, take the floor and introduce our discussion.
Thank you, Marie, very much. Special thanks for the kind words about me. So the title of our discussion today is Belarus after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the challenge of dual political identity. Our discussion will be on record, so I invite all the listeners to send your questions to the Q&A section. After Russia invaded Ukraine and Lukashenko dragged Belarus into this aggression, the democratic part of the society faced new challenges. The image of Belarusians as freedom fighters and the hope of European democracy, which they had after the summer 2020, suddenly in one day transformed in the eyes of many in the image of a war criminal. On the one hand, Western countries are determined to punish the regime for its crimes. On the other hand, the way how they do it often greatly aggravate their already vulnerable position of democratic forces and the Belarusian society. So Lukashenko's crimes casted a shadow on all people with Belarusian passports, and they need again to prove that they are against the regime, that they are against the war. So Sviatlana, you meet a lot of European leaders. You explain to the international community that the regime and Belarusians are not the same. But from what I can see, it's not an easy task since February 24. Just a piece of news from today's morning, the Czech Republic decided not to issue national visas and permanent residencies to the Belarusian citizens until the end of 2023. So my questions would be, how would you describe the implications of this joint Russia's and Lukashenko's aggression against Ukraine for, first, Belarus as a state, as an international actor, for the future of our country, and second, for the Belarusian society, for democratic forces, both in and outside Belarus?
Thank you, Pavel, for this question, because it's extremely difficult and extremely important now to explain our political partners that regime who dragged our country into this war and became collaborates, accomplice to Putin in this war, and Belarusian people who are opposing the war, Belarusian people who had to flee the country because of repressions, and also helping Ukrainians as much as they can, are two different things. So as for consequences for Belarus state, I have to say that Belarusian statehood is now vulnerable as never before because of this war. And I think that Belarus is on the verge of losing independence, because we have Russian troops, Russian equipment, pro-Russian leadership in the country. And the Russian government made it clear that Belarus and Ukraine as independent countries do not exist at all. And in order to preserve the statehood, we need to strengthen civil society, our people, and we must show that it's up to people to decide where they want to live and whom they want to be. And we should work more in the international arena to explain why Belarus matters for European securities. As for consequences for civil society. Yes, you have mentioned that some countries stop issuing visas to Belarusian people, or don't want to accept Belarusian students. And it's also our task to explain that you have to punish regime, but it's high time to help Belarusian people. With stop issuing visas, you are not helping Belarusian civil society. You make 9 million people as hostages in their country. So people in Belarus understand that all the consequences our country has as state and as people is because of dreadful actions of Lukashenko. They don't blame West, they don't blame, I don't know, Zelensky or Tskhanouskaya. They know who's responsible for the fact that Belarus became a pariah. And only thanks to civil society, to Belarusian people, to democratic forces, that for this year and a half of our fight, almost 2 years, we managed to explain Western countries that we are opposing the regime, that we are not the same as regime. And that's why still our partners, our allies trying to help Belarusian civil society and to isolate politically and economically Lukashenko's regime. And of course, it's extremely difficult, especially for the countries who are far away or maybe who don't actually understand what's going on. That's why all my meetings, all the NGOs activity, all the civil society actions are extremely important. Belarusian diaspora also play a huge role. So look, our path never was rather easy. So now new circumstances, new obstacles, but staying together, we will manage to step by step solve everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Sviatlana. And yeah, saying about the history and our path, dear Radoslaw, my question would be about Belarusian EU relations. They passed through many periods of improvement and then frozen in sanctions. You worked as a foreign minister and even met Lukashenko in one of this period when Belarus and the European Union were reproaching each other. I worked this period for the foreign ministry of Belarus. But all the time, Lukashenko ended this improvement of relations by falsifying elections, jailing political prisoners, cracking down on protest movement and civil society. So it happened in 2010, after the elections, presidential elections in 2010. It happened after the presidential elections in 2020. And now, after almost 2 years of punishing the Lukashenko's regime with sanctions, we have Belarus as a co-aggressor state. So there are many sentiments, thoughts that our policy are not efficient or not efficient enough. As we can see, independently of what the EU does, trying to better relations, to improve it with this involvement of Belarus somehow in the dialogue or sanctioning it, the result is always the same. So I would like to ask you 2 questions. What were the main mistakes done by the EU in its relations with the regime of Lukashenko? Was it too tough or too soft on him? Did it change its approach too often? And the second question is about today's day. How would you assess the results of the EU strategy since 2020? Do you see that it brings the EU closer to its goals in Belarus, which are free elections, release of political prisoners, and end of repressions?
Thanks. Of course, my heart goes out to the people of Belarus who've been unbelievably brave in the face of repression that's been worse than what we faced under martial law per capita in the 1980s. And yes, that the war in Ukraine, with its even greater suffering, has taken the spotlight away somewhat from Belarus. Although I have to tell you, we see with admiration that people are willing to risk their lives to sabotage the Russian war effort, or that other people are willing to serve in the Belarusian battalion and now regiment in Ukraine. That shows that the cause of freedom is alive in Belarus. And I think everybody also knows that this invasion of Ukraine would not have happened had it not been for the stolen election in Belarus before that. Because if Belarus had a democratic government, it wouldn't allow those Russian troops through. At the same time, remember that in the international order today, the majority of states are not democratic. And if you count it by populations, it's even worse. So, you know, we are having to deal with undemocratic states, just like you, when you were a diplomat, had to deal with countries that were even less democratic than Belarus. And the thinking here would be that yes, Belarus is an aggressor state by definition, because it allows the forces of aggression. It's an enabler state of the invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, Lukashenko has not yet committed Belarus's own forces to this war. And we don't know exactly why, but it's just possible that he's back to his old game of somewhat balancing between Europe and Vladimir Putin. Now, to answer your question, what were the mistakes of the EU? I'm not sure that's the right framework, because a mistake suggests that if we'd taken another course, the outcome would have been different. And I just don't believe it. You're right that the EU has pursued a fairly consistent policy, which has not yet produced the desired result. The policy has been to offer Lukashenko inducements and sanctions to become more compatible with the West, for Belarus to become a less repressive society. And as you mentioned, there were periods when this worked. So in the 1990s, if you remember, Lukashenko was murdering his political opponents, businessmen, politicians. Then there were dozens of political prisoners in Belarus. We managed to steer Lukashenko to a place where in 2010, just before the then stolen presidential election, there were no political prisoners in Belarus, and Belarus had a somewhat better relationship with the EU and was a less threatening state. Then Lukashenko stole the election, put his competitors in jail, and hope was again extinguished. But there is the other half of Europe's strategy. So one is to induce a better behavior from Lukashenko. But the other half is, if this doesn't work, then to at least give Lukashenko some room for maneuvering, and thereby increase the price of Russia's domination over Belarus. You know, I once talked to Sergei Lavrov, and I told him, you know, by our calculation, your vassalage over Belarus has cost you at least $100 billion in subsidized gas prices. And he said, well, if only that. So I'm afraid Europe can't do much more, because we are not in the business of regime change. What needs to happen is that the war in Ukraine needs to be won by Ukraine. There needs then to be either reform or a regime change in Russia. And that, I think, is the best hope for Belarus.
Thank you, Radoslaw. While I'm reserving my power as a moderator here, I invite you again to send your questions to the chat box. The question to Sviatlana. In one of your recent interviews, you shared a sensational story. It is sensational for me, and I think that's sensational for many, many people who are following Belarus. You said your team has an insight from the Belarusian regime that there was an order to invade Ukraine, but the officers, the high-ranked officers, never agreed to do it. For me, I would say this is a very surprising story. It contradicts everything I know about the Belarusian state system and how it operates. But this was said by Sviatlana Tskhanouskaya, who I respect very much. So I let you and please ask you to share a bit more information about this, how it was happening. When was this order given? Was it February, March, or later? Was it given by Lukashenko, or did you mean that it came from Russia? And how come none of those high-ranked officers were fired or imprisoned for not following the order?
So first of all, I have to say that we received information from our sources that such a decision to enter war was made, but wasn't executed. In February and March, the joining of the Belarusian army seemed to be inevitable. And everybody discussed this, everybody was afraid of this, but it never happened. And of course, why? I have to say that armed forces in Belarus belong to the Belarusian society. And similarly, they don't want to fight Ukrainians for the foreign interests. And also they don't have like combat experience and are not properly equipped. And officers who, according to our information, haven't delivered this order to the army, to the soldiers. They don't want to bear responsibility for Russian war crimes in which Lukashenko became complicit. That it wasn't like our soldiers didn't fulfill this order. This is higher rank military officers didn't deliver this order. Maybe there were discussions between Lukashenko's cronies and military officers, but because military officers realized the moods among army, they realized the real physical state of our soldiers, that they are not experienced and they will be like cannon fodder on the battlefield. So for sure, there was such a threat at the beginning. And of course, our Belarusian mothers who organized the small movement started to call military officers, their sons, persuading them not to fight. It was like a panic situation. And altogether, it didn't make possible our army to participate. But I have to say that, it's sometimes I hear that Lukashenko is not fully involved in this war because our army didn't join Russian army. It's not so. It's Lukashenko is already accomplice, already collaborant in this war, and he has to bear the full responsibility for what he has done to our soil, what he has done to Belarus, and the fact that our soldiers didn't enter Ukrainian territory. It doesn't shift any responsibility from Lukashenko himself.
Thank you. So let's switch now to the topic, my favorite one, negotiations and potential agreements with Lukashenko's regime. Now the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, pushes for such an agreement, saying that we need to talk to Lukashenko and make deals with him just to prevent hunger in Africa. He suggests to lift sanctions from Belarus borders in exchange for Ukraine's grain exports through the territory of Belarus and then passing it through the Baltic ports. Lukashenko seems to be very, very, very supportive for this idea. So I would like to ask my guests, what is your take on this initiative?
So if I may be the first, I have to say that transit through Belarus and lifting sanctions on Lukashenko in return, it's bad idea with the bad consequences for all. And I urge all the countries to restrain. You know that last year, Lukashenko blackmailed the world with migrants. This year, he blackmails the world with hunger. So don't give the fate of millions of people who would probably suffer from hunger in the hands of Lukashenko. Transit through Belarus can cover only about 10% of wheat from Ukraine, and it will not solve the problem, but it will cross out everything that was done. It will devaluate all the efforts that were done by European Union, the USA, to press Lukashenko. Lifting sanctions will open loopholes for Russia too. Instead of solving the problem, you will make it even bigger. It is evident that dictators weaponized food and blackmailed the West. And, it's like a false dilemma, hunger or human rights. And we shouldn't choose in this dilemma. What can actually work, it's the blockade of Ukrainian seaports, and international bravery, of course, is needed here. And I know that it's very important that Ukrainians and Belarusians share this view. And I'm confident that for now, such a deal seems to be impossible, no matter what Lukashenko says.
Radoslaw, what is your take on this? Do you think it may have support from the EU member states? And what consequences may this agreement have for the democratic forces in Belarus? What could be the position of Poland, if I may ask you?
Well, on the position of Poland, you have to ask the Polish government. But I agree with Sviatlana on this. I can understand why Lukashenko wants to do it. It would bring him back into semi-respectability, which he doesn't deserve, but it wouldn't solve the problem. And we also already have a bad experience of Minsk agreements. There was a Minsk agreement on Ukraine, and it proved to be a cul-de-sac. It was worse than the previous formula of discussing Ukraine-Russia issues, which was the Geneva format, which was EU, US, Ukraine, Russia. Whereas Minsk was, France, Germany, Ukraine, Russia in Minsk, and we know the story. But I'd just like to refer to the previous two issues as well. I hope, Sviatlana, that you are right, that Lukashenko gave the order and it was not carried out by the Belarusian military. That would be proof of a remarkable internal resistance and inside the regime. But I wonder, in 1981, we, the Solidarity movement in Poland, told ourselves similar things, that the Polish army is the army of the people. They will not fulfill orders of repression. And of course, then they did. I'm a former defense minister. The internal logic, the DNA of the armed forces is to obey the order. So I suspect it's because Lukashenko is playing some kind of game with Putin. That doesn't make him any less acceptable. But I think in our conceptual analysis, we need to allow for that possibility. And lastly, you mentioned that the Czech Republic has stopped issuing visas to Belarusian citizens, which I would think is a mistake. We don't want to punish the victims of Lukashenko for what Lukashenko is doing. Our sanctions should be smart. But I would allow a possibility that it's a much more mundane reason. Namely, there's a consular war between Belarus and EU member states. Belarus has been expelling consuls. And countries may be stopping the issuing of visas, A, because there's not enough personnel to issue them, and B, to try to force Belarus authorities to give more permissions for consuls and consulates to operate in Belarus.
So we already discussed how hard is the situation in Belarus and how hard for the European Union is to deal with it. So my question, just for me, I'm working on Belarusian issues and I don't see any good answers to my question. So I would like to ask you, how do you see the realistic scenarios? I underline what realistic here for overcoming the crisis, given that Lukashenko doesn't want to leave and make concessions. We are trying sanctions, we are pushing more sanctions, and we already have much and a huger impact of the sanctions since the beginning of Russia's invasion. But Will it lead to these positive scenarios in Belarus or not? So Sviatlana, would you please share, how do you see the future? How could these changes happen in Belarus if we follow what we're doing now?
So first of all, I also rely on the experts' opinions and my sessions, but whenever I read, I see that experts write, I don't know the answer to this question, you know. So I have to say that there can be multiple scenarios, of course, and but for sure, all of them should enter with the free and fair elections. And we do all possible to bring changes as soon as possible and without victims. And therefore, it's since the very beginning, we chose peaceful resistance. You know, we continue to insist on free elections through dialogue. We understand that any resistance at the end will go through negotiations, you know, or dialogue, and we want these changes happen through this way as well. Though now it looks maybe unrealistic, we all understand that situation might change rather quickly. We saw this on the examples of many countries when everything seemed so solid, like broke in a couple of days, you know, and Lukashenko also understands that he has no future. He realizes this, though he's trying to, you know, to keep this power with all the means. He understands that he didn't manage to reestablish control over people's minds since 2020, and still there is a big probability of internal coup d'etat, who knows, and now we understand that everybody is looking at the outcome of the situation in Ukraine, and we understand that with the collapse of Kremlin, there will be collapse of the regime in Belarus, of course, with assistance, with help, with the uprising of Belarusian people. So our task now is to not to wait outcome of the war or the window of opportunity for Belarus, but to work on the transitional period to have this transitional period as smooth as possible, to prepare new reforms, to you know, to communicate with people on the ground, with workers, with people from the nomenclatura, to be prepared. So, and of course, we are working with international structures, proposing them to launch this platform for negotiations, because these negotiations will take place for sure. But of course, we see that maybe sanctions is maybe the only possible leverage from the international society, from the democratic countries, and that's why. So our message is the same: exhaust regime with political isolation, with economic isolation on the one hand, and strengthen civil society, Belarusian people on the other. Show Belarusian people that they are welcomed, that they are not abandoned, that Europeans are waiting Belarus and their family, and we are trying to show perspectives for our country. So people have to choose Lukashenko's country, where everybody is under threat, constantly under threat, or future bright Belarus. Of course, we'll have a lot of difficulties, Pavel, but look, you know the situation rather well. So difficult times, but we have to be strong.
Radoslaw, adding some more points here, Poland experienced this protracted struggle with the dictatorship, and it finally managed to win. But this, from my point of view, happened primarily due to good timing. The USSR was weakened and destabilized, and this made it possible for Poland to embark on the road of political change. So do you think that changes in Belarus without weakening or destabilizing Russia or Putin's regime are possible at all?
That's a very good question. And I've said already that I think the most likely scenario is for Belarus to get this chance if the Putin regime falls in Moscow. But Putin is so deeply engaged in Ukraine now that countries that wouldn't dare to provoke Russia before are doing so. Without this war in Ukraine, but also they wouldn't have the desire, but they would also be afraid of announcing NATO aspirations, Finland and Sweden. They have done so, A, because they got scared, because the intent of Russia has proved to be much worse than most people thought, but also because they are correctly calculating that Putin can't afford a two-front war, and they will get away with it. If you remember, Putin said that he needs to invade Ukraine because of Ukraine's intention to join NATO. Finland and Sweden are announcing their intention to join NATO. And what does Putin do? He's saying, oh, no big deal. So I don't think he would today have the forces to try to do to Belarus what he's doing to Ukraine. In that sense, the timing for a military coup in Belarus is slightly better than before. If the Belarusian military, as Sviatlana was hinting, is more independent of Lukashenka than meets the eye, and if they overthrew him and told Putin not to use his forces or else, their chances of success are now better than there wouldn't have been without the Ukraine war.
And we have one question in our Q&A section to you, Radoslaw. Margarita Litiago is asking you to explain what did you mean by, I'm quoting here, increase the room for maneuver for Lukashenka to increase the cost for Russia. What would it look like concretely? Thank you.
Well, I think by the cost to Russia, I've already explained that Belarus is paying the domestic Russian price for gas. If you compare that to the alternative stream of revenue that Russia would have got for selling that gas to Western Europe, that's your cost. And by room for maneuver, this is somewhat our speculation. Sviatlana thinks it's the resistance of the Belarusian generals. I tend to think it's a mixture of that and Lukashenka, the old fox, smelling defeat and not wanting to share in it. That is a factor in this. But the fact is that at a moment when the Russians wanted Belarus to cut off the supply of Western weapons by moving on the north-south axis from Belarus, Belarus has not yet done it. And we don't quite know the reasons. Pavel Latushka told me in my interview, he thinks that Belarus doesn't have the forces, that the ordinary army is poorly equipped and poorly motivated, and that the real army in the army is only about 5,000 to 10,000, and that's not enough, and they would be afraid of being just mauled by the Ukrainians or highly motivated. I think it's all these things together.
What I see now is that Russia says that it is doing demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine. But what is happening with Belarus, if we continue this analog, is desovereignization of Belarus. It has been happening since 2020. And there is an idea among analytical society. Sviatlana mentioned that you try to listen to it, so you rely on the experience. And I know one analytical center that is lobbying internationally for the official recognition of you as the president of Belarus. Their logic is that Belarus, in case of loss of independence, if this desovereignization leads to a loss of independence, should have an internationally recognized government in exile, similar to what Baltic states had under the Soviet occupation. which the US recognized as temporarily occupied by the Soviet Union. So how would you rate this idea? Do you think it's a smart one?
Well, Poland had a government in exile led by General Sikorski first during the Second World War, and then it persisted in London after the recognition by the Allied powers was removed from it in July 1945 and granted to the communist-imposed, Soviet-imposed government in Poland. It had some impact on the Polish diaspora in the West. In political terms, it was solidarity, really, that that became a partner and the alternative elite and the alternative government, rather than the government in exile. But I'm not excluding the idea. You know, in 1991, when Gorbachev sent Spetsnaz against the Lithuanian patriots under Vytautas Landsbergis, we offered him, we already had a non-communist government, Warsaw as the seat of a Lithuanian government in exile. Sometimes these governments do come back to rule their country. It's something to be considered.
And Sviatlana, as we're talking about recognition of you as the president, we would like, of course, to happy to hear what you think about it.
Thank you, Pavel. You know, I'm rather often criticized, mostly by Belarusians themselves, that I didn't recognize myself as the president. I didn't install government in exile. First of all, I have to say that I don't want to create anything in exile. Maybe in the past, these governments in exile were a life necessity, but you know, the world is changing. Because when you say in exile, it sounds like it's for long, you know, but we hope to return home as soon as possible, not in years, maybe this psychological moment. And, you know, it doesn't matter how people call you. You know, people called me, I don't know, leader of democratic forces in opposition, and some countries, thanks to them, call me president-elect. What means what you are doing? Because let's take the example of Venezuela, when Guaido was recognized as president and he formed a government in exile, and nothing has happened. You know, this naming, of course, it's important, but I'm already representing, you know, the will of Belarusian people in international arena. I'm already recognized, so I have to say that on the very first day of the war, we announced the formation of the cabinet, which will serve as the government in exile. You know, but I don't want to create structures in sake of structures. It must really serve Belarusian people and answer their needs. And a cabinet will serve as the center of power, and hopefully will play a crucial role during a transition period. This cabinet is still on this forming, on the way of its forming, because we just want, we don't want just to change chairs among all the democratic structures, but we want to create something really workable. You know, maybe this is the answer, you know, maybe I don't have anything to add. Our task is to work. I'm already a few days ago, for example, I was invited to speak at OSCE premises as a representative of Belarus. This is also, you know, this is a sign of recognition. What is important is not how you name democratic forces, so Tskhanouskaya or cabinet, you know, it's important not send ambassadors, don't present credentials to Lukashenko, don't recognize him. This is the most important issue. So maybe a little bit chaotic, but yeah, this is the answer. Thank you.
Let me now switch to the internal developments in Belarus. Sviatlana, in Poland, I again bring this parallel from Poland from 80s. One of the driving forces of change was the labor movement. How are things with the labor movement doing in Belarus now? We saw it was active in 2020 in the summer, in autumn, but then it all ended with nothing, with repressions, saying correctly. Are there any signs that under the influence of sanctions, under the influence of the economic downturn, the workers in Belarus will go on strike or oppose the regime, or will just make their voices louder?
Yeah, actually, Pavel, you're right. The workers' movement played a crucial role in the 2020 protests. There were two big waves of strike in August and October, and workers managed to paralyze the work of several enterprises. Unfortunately, this movement was quickly suppressed. Many workers were repressed, detained, many have left, or many have fled. Maybe you have heard that recently one participant of strike of labor movement was committed suicide after interrogation. You know, this awful thing. But the main lesson from 2020 is that the strike wasn't prepared maybe enough. Everything was like very fast, and people didn't realize the changes that was happening with them. In 2021, workers have created the workers' movement, Рабочий рух in Belarusian, which united 24,000 people already. And their main goal is to prepare for the strike properly. You know, now they have time. You know, they are waiting, as all of us, for the right moment, for a trigger, for window of opportunities. The effect of sanctions and anti-war moods within the society can create this moment, and of course, the outcome of the war. And you know, for example, a few weeks ago, maybe you remember, suddenly a strike took place on one of the state enterprises, milk enterprises or somewhat. It was like spontaneous and was caused by low salaries. So it's likely that such protests will become more and more often, and we welcome all the people who are not happy with salaries, with the labor rights, you know, to join a working movement. And it will be task of this working movement to make this grassroots protest successful and efficient. So our workers understand that our economy is worsening because of Lukashenko's actions, not because of the West, Zelensky or Tskhanouskaya, whoever, because Lukashenko brought our country to the state we are at the moment. So we are rely on this working movement, the same as on the BIPOL, and when the moment comes, they they will know how to act efficiently in new circumstances.
And we have one more question by Joseph Nizhnik.
I just refer to this one.
Please, sure.
Because I think Sviatlana is right that you need to keep the forces for change ready. But revolutionary situations usually occur when at least one of the three conditions is fulfilled. The ruling elite is split, the ruling elite has lost the will to repress, in particular to kill, and the regime is bankrupt and unable to pay the forces of repression. I think at least one of those three conditions needs to be in play before you can succeed. And therefore, we need to follow developments inside the Belarusian regime very closely.
Thank you, Radoslaw. And again, let's come back to our Q&A section, and I will read the question from Joseph Nizhnik. He's asking how much the Belarusian society is divided over the relation to Russia. Are there any data regarding popular support for the close ties with Russia? Do you have any info for us, Sviatlana, or Radoslaw? If I don't know if you follow.
I would love to hear your view, because you have alternative sources of information. I'm very suspicious of all polling down in repressive societies. we have all these Levada surveys in Russia, and they're probably well meant and probably not falsified. But when you learn that 90% of Russians asked by Levada pollsters to answer a question, refuse to answer at all anything, then that tells you how imperfect it is. And when you then think how these polls are done, you're either approached in the street or you're called on your phone. Mr. and Mrs. Petrov, do you support the special military operation ordered by our commander-in-chief Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin? And by the way, if you don't, it's 15 years in jail. What do you answer?
Because of this, we don't have any face-to-face polls in Belarus like since 2010, I guess. So that most of them are done through the internet. So Sviatlana, does your team has any info on how friendly, how supportive is the Belarusian society to Russia since 2020 and since their invasion to Ukraine?
So there are two different issues, to attitude to Russia and attitude to invasion of Ukraine, because 86% of Belarusian people are against participation of Belarusian troops in this war, and about the same quantity against the war as the war. But I have to say that since 2020, there were no anti-Russian moods in Belarusian society. It was anti-regime moods, now anti-war moods, because you know that Belarusians are rather friendly nations and they would want to be friends with everyone. But now Belarusian people start asking questions to themselves about the future of Belarus. What country we want to be? Do we want to be like accomplice of Russia? Do we want the same situation as in Russia, and there will be disaster, economic default, and Russia will be a pariah for long years, or we want a normal, safe future as in Europe? Belarusian people are not fleeing Russia because of repressions; they are fleeing to European Union, and now this support of the way of behavior of Russians is not supported by Belarusian people more and more. So still, I don't think that Belarusian people see enemy in Russia. Of course not. But we distinguish like Kremlin as in our country, regime and Belarusian people. The attitude to this division in Russia a little bit different, but still there is the Kremlin and people of Russian Federation. So I don't know what will be going on changes towards Russia, but look. Still, Belarusians want to be friends with everyone. How to cope with this, I don't know. Thank you.
And I have a follow-up here. As you said, Belarusians don't support the war. We saw how people under such repressions, under those 2 years of huge repressions, incredible repressions, unprecedented ones, they still organize these partisan sabotage actions on the railway. Belarusian battalions went to fight for Ukraine. And in one of your recent interviews to Corriere della Sera, you mentioned that there is 1,500 Belarusians fighting for Ukraine in Ukraine. What are the recent news from inside Belarus? We saw this partisan sabotage actions till April or till May. And then there was this changes in legislation that makes the authorities just kill their opponents and to say that they were preparing terrorist attacks. So they suggested a death penalty for this kind of actions. And then there were no news about kind of other sabotage action. Do you think that this is the reason why, or the reason is that Russian forces, Russian troops, like the majority of them just left Belarus and we don't have such a need right now?
Yeah, actually, the fact that there are no more sabotages is because there are no more Russian troops in Belarus, almost no Russian troops. You know, there are up to 2,000-3,000 people in military centers, but I don't think that this new law about death penalty would frighten those people who are ready for these acts of sabotage. But it like coincided that Russian troops left Belarus, and then this law was executed. So now Belarusian, and you know, when during the first months of the war, Belarusian people, ordinary citizens, sent information about Russian troops trespassing our country, about missiles that have been launched. They gave this information to Ukrainian army, and it was rather helpful. Ukrainian army was rather grateful to Belarusian people. But now the context is different. Now there is no necessity to disrupt railways. So our like people still on the ground, millions of them, and they are doing their part of the job. Very small part, but very, very essential. If a threat of Russian troops will exist in the future, so I think that this disruptions or other ways of sabotage will for sure take place.
Thank you, Sviatlana. And Radoslaw, I would like to hear your experience. Like Poland and Ukraine relations has always been friendly, but not easy, I would say, not easy in all of the issues. The same I would characterize the relations of the democratic forces in Belarus, especially since 2020. They are friendly, but not that easy. So what would be your recommendations for the Belarusian democratic forces on how to approach Ukraine, how to maybe position the democratic forces for the Ukraine in terms of the war?
I guess you're asking me the question with a perspective of years, maybe decades. But, you know, one of the silver linings of this horrible war is that Western Europeans are suddenly interested in Eastern European history. And they're discovering, you know, how the split among Rus-speaking tribes occurred, the legacy of the Mongol horde and the legacy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which, as we know, had Belarusian as its state language, and where Belarus, with the chase flag, was a key part. You know, there is a lot of history behind all this. Our populist government was kind of Ukraine skeptic. They are very fixated on the past, on Polish suffering during the Second World War, which of course was very real. But now they seem to have got it, that the traditional policy of successive Polish governments, which was to encourage the independence of our eastern neighbors, you know, they seem to have returned to that mainstream. And I think Belarus is probably a beneficiary of that as well.
Thank you, Radoslaw. And Sviatlana, I know that you now have an interview and you need to go, so thank you so much. And I wanted to ask one more question, so I think that this will question just be left to Radoslaw. Thank you, Sviatlana. Good luck to all of us, and hopefully we'll meet you somewhere in the democratic Belarus in the near future.
Yeah, thank you again. Pavel. Thank you, Radoslaw. I just wanted to say that Radoslaw is a good parent of my husband. You know, yeah, he's taking care of him.
Proud and hope to see him out of jail as soon as possible. Good luck to you, Madam President.
Thank you. Thank you for a nice conversation. Bye.
So, Radoslaw, my question was I don't know, maybe in the easiest one of today's discussion or the hardest one, and this was supposed to be to both of the guests, but Anne Applebaum wrote a brilliant article before the war that bad guys are winning. So are bad guys winning?
Yes, to some extent they are. I've mentioned it before. If you look at the Freedom House's index of the tendency towards democracy and autocracy, in the last few years, clearly democracy has not been in the ascendant, quite the contrary. And there are several reasons for it, you know, one of which is that we thought that the World Wide Web, by linking people and giving everyone access to information, would be a great democratizing force. And then we discovered that A, autocrats have learned to use it, and B, that that the way that tech companies structure their algorithms and they optimize them for grabbing attention, and what grabs attention is people fighting one another, that's drained social capital and trust in institutions. And that has helped autocrats and autocratic populist movements. There are many reasons, you know, there are mistakes by elites, the financial crisis, the inequalities that have become too big. And I'm afraid these autocrats around the world have the support of other autocrats. You know, there is a sort of autocrat international. And we have assumed for far too long that democracy is so obviously better that it doesn't need defending or making an argument for. That needs to be corrected.
So I think that we will stop here. Hopefully that the bad guys will lose the war, not only the war for Ukraine, but the war for the world. Thank you, Radoslaw.
Inshallah, death to tyrants.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for the listeners, and I hope to see you again once we organize the events on Belarus with the ECFR. Bye-bye.